Imagine opening a safety dashboard and seeing a sea of green, fewer incidences, lower recordables, metrics turning in the right direction. And on paper, this signals progress. But what if the quietest indicators, the near misses, the small operational paper cuts, the signals that slowly disappear from reporting, are actually pointing to a deeper risk accumulating beneath the surface? Today, we're going to be stepping into that uncomfortable space between what gets measured and what's truly happening on the front line, because sometimes the absence of incidences doesn't always reflect safer conditions. Sometimes it simply means that the narrative being told is incomplete. Welcome back to the Safety Brief, the podcast where we unpack the conversations shaping the future of safety, risk, and operational performance. In today's episode, Paper Cuts or Fatalities, we're going to be diving into four key themes: the tension between leading and lagging indicators, the overlooked predictive values of near misses, the risk behind perfectly green dashboards and vanity metrics, and the overflowing disconnect between ESG expectations and frontline reality. Together, these conversations are pointing toward a bigger question. What does it actually mean for safety data, and how does that actually look? And why does transparency, context, and trust ultimately matter more than perfection? So, jumping into leading and lagging indicators, Scott, I know you probably have a lot of personal experience. You've spoken about leading and lagging indicators at so many conferences. So, I guess we can start off with, why do you think, from your perspective, these metrics still dominate leadership conversations, even though they don't really tell the full story?
Wow, I was just thinking of your introduction. And first, Monica, welcome to the new year, right? It's a really great time to do this type of podcast. And I always benefit from a tremendous amount of research, and you never give me that time. So it's probably just good to hear listeners speak based on his or her past experience. And I certainly think this is an excellent subject. So when I think about, why organizations kind of look around safety and measure lagging indicators, I think really and very honestly that lagging indicators dominate because they're very easy to measure, right? And they're very easy to explain to
Mm,
a set of executives. And I think, throughout my career, if I go back in my career 36 years ago, executives, plant managers, operations leaders,
mhm,
they really never cared about what we would call leading indicators. Today, they only cared about lagging indicators because it was very easy for them to understand those measures because that's how they had been leading. And it's very easy to trickle those up to a senior executive that reports it to their senior executive. So they just provide, I think, what we think is a sense of control, right? So during board
mm,
meetings, during auditing, right, being able to compare yourself
mhm,
to maybe a sister organization or maybe even within the industry vertical that you're working in, being able to compare that information that is fairly simple
mm,
to get is why we kind of pin our hopes there. I think the risk is that we want to measure failure frequency instead of operational health. And I think that's the big problem. Safety performance really should be evaluated by how risk is managed before incidents are even occurring. And I'll give you an example of that very early in my career. When I was in manufacturing, we went nearly a year without recordable injury. And we were
mhm,
celebrating that milestone. I had the plant manager asking me what we could give away. We just spent a lot of money celebrating the fact that we worked almost this 12 months without
mhm,
a recordable injury. At the same time, I was noticing, some things happening behind the scenes. Housekeeping audits, they were declining. My machine guarding issues were increasing. Supervisor was spending less time on the manufacturing floor. So the injury rate on one hand, it looked great. But I also noticed that my exposure was rising. And then, of course, what always happens when we take our eye off the ball, I had
mhm.
a hand injury that reset the recordable count totally, right? But these warning signs were really visible for months, just no one would listen to me talk about it. So when I think about lagging indicators, why we do them, it's really because organizations have normalized that that is the way that you judge success. So yeah, when I think about this topic, and I would also say, Monica, that I've never been fearful of blended metrics, and I challenge, my peers, my colleagues that are safety practitioners, they want to go one path or they want to remain in another. And my pushback on them always is that why aren't you blending, leading indicators along with your lagging indicators? Because if you do your leading work quite well, you should have a natural evidence of what your lagging indicators provide, right? So I think they both go hand in hand.
I agree. Actually, one step back for a sec. For the folks who are listening who are not up to speed with all this EHS terminology, can you explain the difference between leading and lagging indicators?
Yeah, lagging indicators are things that happen after the fact, right? So you've had a what we call a recordable injury or even, some other type of loss. You've passed this threshold, right, where it's entered into this definition of how we define loss. So if I was in
Mhm.
safety, right, somebody is injured, maybe they've lacerated their hand.
Mhm.
That's crossed a threshold where I've lost something. For many practitioners, that's a recordable injury or some type of medical response type of event. But that could be, different things. If I was in process control and I experienced downtime on a piece of equipment, well, that would pass a threshold, right? So that would become, quote, a lagging indicator. When I think about leading indicators, it's all of that programming that supports what you want to prevent. So things like attending training would be a leading indicator. So participation in an observations program would be a
Mhm.
leading indicator. So many times we're trying to really judge the level of participation within the work system to judge if it's leading or lagging.
Right. Okay. I mean, I often hear people say that our numbers are down, so we must be safer, but I guess that doesn't always feel and paint the full picture. Am I correct?
Well, and I think that's correct, right? And I would even back up on my response is that, I feel that, what I told you is the definitive, right, definition of both of these. It wavers depending on what organization you're talking with, because
Hmm.
I've noticed some of my colleagues that claim to be using this as a leading indicator that I would define as a lagging indicator. However, I don't have all of that story behind that. I don't know how they're actually measuring some of that information. So you will find this perplexity of understanding, defining what leading and lagging is, but it all goes back to the organizations that are using those metrics and how they're being used. So I have friends that have probably 20 leading metrics, and I have some that have just a few, right? So it just depends on where that organization is, how they judge, their program, and what are the things they're actually trying to benefit from their programming.
That's true. I mean, in the spirit of tracking and trying to paint the full picture, I think near misses is actually another valuable data point, but it's also
Yeah.
overlooked. So, I mean, in your experience, are organizations actually using near miss reporting as an early system, or is it still kind of treated like that admin afterthought?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Man, this has been a discussion again for the entire duration of my career. I would say probably near miss reporting is used more now than ever. However, I think some of the resident problems that we've always had are still there, right? So near miss reporting, what I really, I even redefined this is that I called this concern reporting when I was leading my organizations, because near miss, how do you define that? Is that I almost lost my finger, so that's my near miss, or it's a
Mhm.
scratch that didn't need medical attention, but it could have. Is that a near miss? So I even changed the definition for leading my programs to concern reporting. But any way you define this is that near miss reporting or concern reporting, it only works when workers trust the response that they're going to get. And
Hmm.
I'll tell you what I've noticed is that, some of the clients that we even have in Intellects, when they invite me to look at their system, when they invite me to consult them, I go over to their corrective action process, which really houses a lot of what their near miss reporting is. And I'll see, 1,000, I'll see 1,500, I'll see 2,000 different
Hmm.
near misses that have been put into the system, and then they just stay there. They linger. And when I ask that question, I said, "Well, why aren't you removing these? Why aren't you fixing these issues?" The
Hmm.
response is really the same, is that, well, we don't have time, or that's expense, right? So there's a myriad of reasons, some of them good, of why we didn't do those things, right? So near miss reporting, when we ask, and many times as a frontline employee, when we ask them to report, it only works if they get a response from that report. So they
Hmm.
want things fixed. They want them removed from the system. And if we're not going to remove them, they're owed a conversations of why they didn't. And that is really why I converted my thoughts into saying, well, just tell me what you're concerned about. And that really eased the tension across my entire organization because they didn't have to define what a near miss was, but they could easily define things that they were concerned about. Right.
Hmm.
And then if I didn't agree with them or my teams didn't agree with them, we could go have that conversation. Right. So when we started seeing these things, one, it opened up our eyes to things that we didn't consider as professionals. So those closest to the work could actually tell us information that we didn't know. Many of them that were better, right, at identifying the risks that they were assuming, so we could fix those things. And we got, very aggressive in doing that. But even things that we didn't on, right? The conversation
Hmm.
was magical because we could share risk understanding, we could teach them basic skills, right? And we could respond much differently. So the first thing is that absolutely near misses are concerns, are early warning signals when we
Hmm.
think about how to prevent things from happening. But it's only as good as the response of the management team at making sure that those responses are effective in eliminating and sustainably removing that issue from the work process. I think that when I think about near miss reporting, if it's purely near miss reporting, serious incidents, they often have a lot of these visible precursors, right, in
Hmm.
early reports, and that's really where near miss reporting comes in, as a very effective tool, is that we
Hmm.
can start looking at all of these near miss type of reports and looking for trends or looking for segments of patterns that would indicate that we're going to have a future problem, right, with this particular issue. And I often, kind of think about this. I had at one of my facilities, operators had been, reporting several near misses around fork trucks and a pedestrian intersection. So, I led the paper business for quite a long time, and fork trucks and pedestrians, right, and keeping them separated was a very difficult task. So
Hmm.
the reports were being logged, but we were treating them individually. So we would look at this particular event and say, well, we've got that problem. Let's put a barrier up, and then we'd go on to do other work. Months later, a serious incident, occurred in that same area, right? It was the same area, but the circumstances was just a little bit different. So we reviewed the data. The pattern was obvious. We were seeing these same type of what I would say immediate causes and even some root causes. Traffic flow was different. The line of sight changed. The production pressure was all of them. They were all these contributing factors. So that data was in there, but we didn't treat it as a near miss or as a
Hmm.
signal. So that's really what opened my eyes. And I think, Monica, it's one of the reasons that I joined Intellects is that all of us have things like near miss reporting with all of these bits of data, right? Thousands and thousands of entry points, and we don't even see, right, predictable patterns in the information or the data that we see every single day. So we tend to think of things individually when we
Hmm.
could be thinking of them, right, accumulatively. And so that's one of the things I really like. about working at intellects is that we can take that data, we can massage, right? We can marinate on that data, and we
Hmm.
can give you, right, what that answer is, or what that prediction shows, or what that pattern may help
Hmm.
you understand differently, right? So I think that learning, right, speed matters a lot more than just report volume, you know. So I think that that is one of the clues that I would leave our audience with is that learning, right? Learning what's happening in the work process means more than just driving up this count of near misses. And I would also say this, Monica, is that, you know, this is going to be my podcast before it's over because I keep thinking of things, right, to say is that there's probably not a safety practitioner that is listening that is at some time in their career been pressured to drive up near miss reporting, right? It's a very
Right.
common, right, initiative for organizations to do. John, you're required to put in two near misses a month, or you know, Sally,
Hmm.
you're required to fix one thing, you know, this quarter, right? All of that stuff is noise. And then many times you find employees just putting things in there so you'll go away, right? So you wind up with a lot of data that doesn't mean anything, right? So there's
Right.
a delicate balance of what you need, right? And then the motivation to drive the behavior that you're looking for in the organizations that you lead.
Absolutely. I think when we talk about incident reporting and prevention at Intellects, a lot of the feedback, and you've touched on it, is that teams want more reporting and they'll do what they have to do to get it, but they don't always know what to do once the volume starts coming in. And I
That's
think you
right.
did cover that perfectly. So, another topic that I hear frequently is that there's this idea of green dashboards. And for those listening who are not familiar with what green dashboards are, it's just an EHS term used to describe when things are going well. So there's no incidents. We're in the green for budget, whatever it may be. But going back to the point, everything looks perfect at a glance when you have a green dashboard.
Mm.
But how do leaders tell the difference between meaningful performance and these vanity metrics? Like, for example,
Yeah.
Steve can climb a ladder and he falls off. He didn't die, so it's fine, but he severely injured himself. I mean, are there certain indicators that tend to look good but don't actually drive safer behaviors? What have you been
Well, of
hearing?
course. Yeah, you know, you can think about this. Participation metrics, right, really tell this story. And I would say, you know, your question is quite an accurate depiction
Mhm.
of what we like to see, right? Especially senior leaders, what they want to see on a dashboard is that, oh, I love my dashboard green, right?
Mhm.
Because really it means that I don't have to focus on anything. But what it tells me is that probably my indicators are not challenging enough,
Mhm.
right? If we're meeting everything every day, you know. So I always like green, right? But I learn more from yellow and red. That's what means the most to me is that where do I see these fractures within the safety process, right? Am I being too easy? But going back to your original question about vanity metrics, they are usually participation type of metrics that become active in your tracking programs, right? So,
Mhm.
for example, I'll kind of give you, you know, an example of this is that, you know, training is one of those leading metrics that I think probably every safety professional uses if they do, you know, attach a leading metric. But
Mhm.
participation and actively learning, right, are two totally different things. Is that if I were to ask an employee to come to a knowledge sharing session on lockout tagout, they can check the box that they are there, but they could also leave, right, without knowing what I was trying to teach them, right? Am I doing
Mhm.
skill development? Am I testing them? Am I developing quizzes to make sure that they know what to
Mhm.
do when they leave, you know, that room? So a vanity metric would be, oh, I have this many people that attended this training session. Now, what in the back of my mind, you know, what I'm asking or telling myself, oh, I hope they learn what I was actually trying to do in that session. So to on a dashboard, I'm green, right? In my office, I might be yellow or red, right? So green dashboards, they really do hide a lot of weak parts of your system. So you really have to know what metrics you're actively tracking that make a difference. So for
Mhm.
me, you know, an employee going to training, right? I would, you know, change that metric to say this many employees or this rate, right, of test scores came from that activity, right? So I can test, I can make sure that was meaningful. So meaningful, I think, indicators connect to exposure reduction. If I was teaching things like energy isolation training, for example, I should see that. I should see the behavior changed on the floor. And I write quite a lot is that, and I was thinking about some of this, especially around training, is that what makes right training successful? Well, you should be able to see the behavior change on the
Hmm.
manufacturing floor or on the construction site. There should be some change in
Hmm.
what you were doing, right? What you were relaying. I also remember, reviewing a dashboard one time where observation numbers were very, very high across every site that I had. They were very, very high. And I looked at that and I said, "Oh wow, what strong engagement." When I look closer, right, most of the observations that I were seeing were very low risk, right?
Hmm.
And they were completed very quickly to meet these quotas that we had put in front of everyone. So very few resulted in what I called effective, corrective actions. So we achieved the metric, right? But the risk was not being reduced at all. So they had just picked what I say cherry picked things that they could report on. So vanity metrics, I think they're the ones that we decide that we can meet easily, right? And we can make a dashboard show up. If you go back, to how we look at lean manufacturing practices and Kaizen, all those kind of things, right? That we care about and leading process forward. Many of those did come from Toyota, right? When we kind of look at them, and there was an idea that you should never look at a dashboard and see all green, right? And that really tells you that you've not been challenging enough to the system, and your results are almost predictable if you didn't do that.
Hmm.
So I've always tended to lean there is that if I see all green across a dashboard, I'm going to think to myself is that the metrics that I'm pursuing were easy to pursue and easy to have success for.
Hmm.
That may work for me, but it's not taking risk away from my safety work system.
Right. And I guess someone on your side of the business knows that green or too green is not good. Someone like me on, like, say, the marketing side or the admin side may look at this and say, wow, this is perfect. Like, we're doing great. I have no complaints. So, for somebody in my shoes, what kind of questions should they maybe ask when things are feeling a little too positive?
Yeah, I would say the number one thing is if you were to look at a dashboard, right? One, I don't think it's just you, right? I think it's more than you. I always try to pull two or three people together from different perspectives. But let's think about this. If a safety metric, what safety metric is the organization celebrating
Hmm.
that worries you, right? So if you're somebody that's in marketing and you see a green dashboard, you see all this green across, the top line. It should beg the question is what are they celebrating? And as you look at that metric, what worries you about that celebration, right? So I was telling you that, just a few moments ago is that we've celebrated as organizations for things that, kind of rested in the back of my mind and it worried me. For example, right, the cost of incidents.
Hmm.
The cost of an incident is, getting your total incident rate down from this number to this number the next year.
Hmm.
And if you put enough pressure on the organization, you can absolutely make that metric, please the senior leadership team
Hmm.
because you'll force reporting right under the water level, right? So people
Hmm.
won't report, right? They're fearful of doing that. And you start messing around with, psychological safety where people don't feel right open enough to share
Hmm.
honestly with what happens, right? And we
Right.
do that a lot with metrics. We'll set out this number and we'll set out this target. We'll make sure that everybody has communicated what that target is in the organization, and then we'll measure, right, throughout the year, throughout the month to make sure we're meeting that target. And we put much pressure
Hmm.
reporting goes. well, basically unreported, right? That they
Hmm.
fear missing an artificial target that may not even be achievable under normal circumstances. So I would say that I would say somebody, that sees green across a dashboard, they
Hmm.
should just ask questions. Is there something about that really worries you? Does that metric, right, encompass all of the information or the data that it needs to encompass? And then
Hmm.
how do you validate, right, engagement quality behind all of those things that you're seeing on that dashboard, which are many times, right, participation metrics, right? How are you validating that information? Is that a check at the door? Is that somebody with a
Hmm.
checklist that said that? So I would say this, it's those questions, right? How do you validate that information, right? What are you celebrating that worries you
Hmm.
about that green, dial? And then what are the things that you were not allowed to measure, that you think are important? Because the other side of this is that I, unless you're in my business, right, where you're looking at data and quite encompassing amounts of information, as you go up the organizational chain,
Hmm.
you're only allowed to have so certain numbers of metrics, right? So
Right.
as you look at that dashboard, is it big enough? Is it global enough? Does it cover everything that you need to measure to say that you're going to be successful? So there's a lot of that kind of stuff that you would want to know, and you don't have to be a practitioner to even want to know that information, right? Is that, what are
Hmm.
you celebrating that still worries you, right? How do you validate that that's real, right?
Hmm.
And then are you covering all the metrics that you believe is going to give you the best success?
No, I think you raised a valid point about how it almost kind of feels like safety has moved beyond operations and it's more into reputation. And it ties back to that
Yeah.
point about pressure on the organization to present a certain narrative. So it got me thinking, how do you, or what do you recommend for companies to kind of balance that transparency with the pressure to show that we're doing better year over year, but without actually putting real risk with keeping it all green?
Yeah, I get this question quite often, especially from younger practitioners, right, that are being maybe coached to do
Mhm.
things a certain way. I think as practitioners, we always have to be very adaptive. We always have to be flexible, but there should be that stopping point where your ethics, right, and what
Mhm.
you know about leading safety and health or environmental program, where there's a stop, right? And I think it's that fine line between all of those things is that I've seen practitioners defend points, right, to
Mhm.
the to actually, where it becomes dismissive, right, from a senior leadership team. And I look at that and I counsel them with saying there was plenty of flexibility in how you were leading that discussion on the answer that you actually
Mhm.
wanted versus what you would accept. So there's plenty of that goes around. But there also has to be this line of where you will not cross, right?
Right.
So if you absolutely know that we need to measure something, right, we need to measure it, right? And that's all based on, everything from compliance, right,
Mhm.
to how capable you need the workforce to be, to what the behaviors that you're trying to drive in that organization. And then finally, how accountable you want management to be in making sure that you can deliver, right, success as was outlined in your agreements, right, to do your
Mhm.
job. So there's all these stopping points, but I think for us as practitioners, right,
Mhm.
ethics, compliance, those kind of things ring true of saying we will stop here and we have to have, that piece of information to go forward.
No, I love that. So I guess more just to conclude everything, I love that the main message here is that consistency and honestly matters way more than just having that green dashboard and the perfect numbers. But if incidents alone isn't the goal, do you have an example of what good safety data actually looks like in a more mature organization?
Yeah, I think three things, right? One I've already mentioned is mature safety data. It shows participation, right? It shows how we've learned. It shows how we are controlling effectiveness, right? So
Mhm.
those are three things. It shows that behavior is changing, right? And then finally, it shows that my management team is being accountable for the things that I care about, right? So when I think about the data that I want, when I think about, I'm controlling incidents, right? And that's my objective. I don't think that that's true. I think when I think about it in the lens of what does the safety process look like, not just incidents, what's the safety process look like? There's a lot of things that identify that. I've always used the same four things to drive my safety process. It's how compliant we were, and now we call those table stakes, right?
Mhm.
Everybody has to be compliant. The next level of implementation for me is how capable my workforce is, and am I giving them the capacity to give their knowledge away, right? So if I could do that, that requires me to do things differently, but it requires the workforce to mature in a different way. And then if I
Mhm.
can get people to give themselves away, right, then I can attach another element called behavior, right? And behavior means is what do I want to see in the workforce? How do I want them to act? Right? What are the words that I want them to say when they're faced with a decision that compromises safety, right? So that's another
Mhm.
indicator of safety maturity, not certainly not all of it. And then finally, I that the fourth element, which really became one of the harder ones for me, is working with senior leaders, right? Is can
Mhm.
I hold this group of senior leaders accountable for the things that I think are important in making
Mhm.
sure everyone goes home, safe at the end of their shift. So to me, that's what, a mature safety culture looks like. And
Mhm.
now I can backward or reverse engineer this and say, well, what are some of those measures, right, that really show that? Right.
Mhm.
So I can certainly do several things, right? Mature safety data shows participation, right? It shows learning. It shows control. It shows a leadership team that's doing safety walks, right, weekly, or they're out on the floor every single day. So there's a myriad of data points that you can measure, but I think you really have to understand what your management system is, what these system elements are that you care about. I shared
Mhm.
four of mine, and then building out a metric that measures that, right? And then trust, I think it shows up, right? So when I look at all of this and think about your question, mature safety data, it really shows that trust is showing up because the work is happening quite consistently, right? If you're going
Yeah.
to measure me on behavior, right, then how is that graph going? Is plateauing okay for a while? Do I have fits and starts, right? And that may be okay, right? But what it really shows, and it kind of goes all the way back to green dashboards, is that strong cultures, right,
Mhm.
surface problems very quickly, right? So measuring that, right, means that I'm going to measure a lot of things, right? And I'm going to be looking at reflections or trends, right, or patterns in my information to understand it as quick as I possibly can. Now, I think about that, right? And one of my organizations, we were tracking very quickly, hazards and getting things done, and they were being reported. I'd turn them around in a week. At first, all of this data really uncomfortable because the more we did, the more
Mhm.
data we consumed, right? So employees were seeing that we were doing things, so they would give us more, right? And then, it became uncomfortable because the resolution times they became longer, right? So
Mhm.
so on one hand, man, I'm glad these people are really reporting things, right?
Mhm.
But once they learned that I would fix the things that they reported more, right?
Mhm.
So over time, teams began competing, right? They were going after these hazards faster. They were verifying these controls. So what I did, right, because I just couldn't assume them all, I started asking them. I said, "Can you help me get those things done?"
Mhm.
Right. So one success led to an uncomfortable period, led to success, right? So I was able to extend my safety process purely through metrics. Now, I would say this because we both work for a technology company.
Mhm.
Now, working with EHS technology, I can see the same patterns, but I don't have this uncomfortable period anymore, right? Now I can focus on cycles, I can focus on corrective action closure, I can focus on frontline reporting consistency, and I can get all that information very, very quickly. And it's one of the reasons I joined Intellex is because I
Mhm.
had data line everywhere, and I literally had business analysts, right, as parts of my team to understand all of these things that I just described. but I was very late in the decisions that I needed to make. And so today, as I kind of think about all these things that we've talked about, right,
Mhm.
you can construct dashboards that reflect really what you're wanting to do. You can put together leading and lagging metrics based on all of these applications, right, that you may purchase and start to use, right? So there's a lot of things that really helps you
Mhm.
today that was not even existent, right, readily 10 years ago. So you can do a
Mm.
lot of things that you've always wanted to do, and now technology has allowed you to do them in a very efficient way. And safety performance, right, really benefits from that.
No, I agree. I think the two main themes that I'm hearing, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm speaking more from the admin side of the business, is one, you need to be able to track that data, and obviously technology helps with that. But I think the main other theme is that you need to have somebody actually responsible for that data and putting that data into practice. So if you had to pick one, which one would you say would be more beneficial? Having that top down leadership actually take it seriously and do something about it, or having that data in the first place?
Oh my goodness, that's a loaded question. I want them both. I would tell you this, and I get really excited when I think about mobile technology, right? We basically have put the safety management system or the EHS and quality management system on a mobile platform, right? So we have literally put that in the hands of the person that is willing to use it, right? And to me, the closer that I can to the front line and ask them to participate and partner with me through a data exchange is as far as a reach that I really want to make today, right?
Mm.
So I think about it much differently than I did and further back in my career, right, where I tried to get to the machine floor, where I tried to get to the front line, where I had paper systems and asked people to contribute to it, right? There was a lot of barriers to success, when I was doing that. So technology for
Mhm.
me, it's getting as much data as I can so I can start right using technology to do those things like noticing trends or
Right.
start accumulating that data much differently. That for me, right, as a practitioner. Now to answer your other question, right, me having that information allows me to produce metrics that matter the most to a
Mhm.
senior, leadership team. I'm okay, right, with them wanting to understand lagging indicators, but what I want to do is introduce leading indicators in such a way that they value, right? So that's what I want to do as a practitioner. I would also say this is that I don't have to be exactly right in what we're talking about today. I think professionals are all on a different journey, right? So they
Mhm.
know when to pull some of these things right into their programs and when not, right? So I think the
Mhm.
most important thing that they can do today is to start understanding where they are in their safety journey and then what that next step is. It may be backing up and saying we're going to really do well with one metric and then
Mhm.
just assume that we're going to add an additional metric to that as time goes on. So all of us that are a different journey. I led, in industry verticals that may be different than some of our listeners are listening to. And some of them may be more advanced than I am, right? So, but I would say that using data very, very effectively, it may be different for me. I want to go very deep in my organization, right? I
Mhm.
even think senior leaders want to understand that information. They just want it maybe in a more concise fashion.
I honestly can't think of a way better way to wrap up that episode. I mean, we explored how safety performance is often interpreted. We
Yeah.
talked about the dominance of lagging indicators, the missed signals. And if there's one takeaway, it's this, that meaningful safety performance isn't about presenting those flawless numbers. It's about creating visibility into the risks that exist before they become outcomes. And thank you, Scott, for helping unpack a lot of this and
You're
sharing
more
your
than welcome.
insights. If this conversation challenged the way that you think about safety data, make sure that you're following the safety brief for more discussions. And remember, progress doesn't come from perfect reporting, it comes from building cultures grounded in transparency, learning, and trust. We will see you guys next
Thank you.
time.